Well, hello again on the third issue of the DePIN Hub newsletter weekly recap. Got this cold cup of almost completely drank Americano coffee. We're not even going to drink that. We're just going to leave that there because it looks nice. And the week of September 30th through October 4th. We're crossing months, ladies and gentlemen. We're recapping what happened last week. And in this one, we're bringing you something special. We're going to get to it in a moment, but essentially a 100+ page deep dive report on DePIN, probably the most comprehensive report to date. In case you didn't have 4 to 6 hours to read through it yourself, don't worry. We're going to cover the juicy details and some of our own insights about the report today. But before we do that, quick update, a newsworthy event on October 2nd, multiple flagship DePIN projects and investors traveled to Capitol Hill, the headquarters of US Congress, to update the US government on the potential of DePIN. So Multicoin Capital, one of the biggest investors in all of Web3, along with some familiar faces like Filecoin, Helium, GeoNet, HiveMapper, and our friends CES Storage. So in celebration, we're running a little campaign with our friends at CES. So let me see it here. What you're going to do is we released a tweet on X. You're going to quote, repost that tweet answering 2 questions, and you're only going to be able to find the answers to these questions, unless you really know CES, by reading our deep dive article, which can be found on their listing in DePIN Hub, or inside of our blog in the research section. So you're going to need to read through it, find the answers to these 2 questions, quote, retweet, put in your answers, and you're going to have a chance to win. Well, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to check our newsletter, but it might be some future CES tokens. It might be some free decentralized storage capacity for your data. You'll have to check the newsletter and find out. But big news, ladies and gentlemen, when DePIN travels to Capitol Hill and the government starts listening. Now, moving on to our featured content. Based out of New York, there's a venture capital firm known as Compound. So Compound is a forward-thinking, thesis-driven, research-focused VC investing in forward-thinking technologies such as AI, ML, robotics, biohacking, and longevity, and Web3, namely DePIN. So recently, 2 of their researchers posted a 100+ page deep dive report on DePIN, titled DePIN, Imperfect Present, no one's perfect, and its Promising Future. A deep dive. So today we're going to be deep diving on that. What is imperfect about DePIN at present, and what are some promising things to come? Talking about the different segments or categories of DePIN and some of the flagship projects within those categories, and going a little bit further as well. So we're going to walk you through the whole report. I'm assuming maybe you didn't have 5 to 6 hours to read through it yourself, and if you did, you're a fucking nerd. Consider this your summary. Woo-wee. Now, we have 6, as they say in China, 6 categories that Compound divided this report into: telecom and connectivity, energy, compute storage and bandwidth, decentralized AI, data capture and management, and finally, services, which is a fairly broad category. Before we jump into it, one important note that they mentioned: for DePIN to succeed as projects and as a category, you need at least one of the following. Follow me to the whiteboard. We need a situation where scaling infrastructure, these are servers, is costly. Number 2, we need a situation where there is an opportunity for efficiency gains by matching supply and demand in a better fashion, cutting out that pesky middleman. Number 3, the ability to leverage underutilized assets or resources to improve the end state, making it faster, more resilient, cheaper, whatever you want. One light bulb goes to 3. Jumping into our first category, telecom and connectivity. They divided that into 3 subcategories: mobile, fixed wireless, and Wi-Fi. So mobile, they mainly talked about Helium, which is kind of the poster child of mobile and of DePIN, and their ability to partner with MNOs using their network for data offload, but also jumping over to their hotspots for lower costs in certain locations. Basically, patting them on the back for the traction they were able to receive in the real world, which is very important for this ecosystem to succeed in the long run.
Good job.
They also talked about Carrier One, which is a little bit lesser known on the mobile side, and Really Network, which is focusing on privacy. Then they jumped into fixed wireless. So fixed wireless is essentially broadband connectivity or fiber optics, but propagated through the air. Now, they talked about Andrina and Althea. So apparently if you work in fixed wireless, you have to start and end with an A. Andrina recently raised 18 million, led by Dragonfly, so a major investor in in crypto in general.
Money, 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 money.
And Althea is building a layer 1 that serves as a payment layer for basically all decentralized telecom networks. Some other ones that they didn't mention to look out for would be Weaver Labs and their cell stack solution. Now, however, they did say there is a chance that this entire space of fixed wireless could be disrupted by LEOs, or low Earth orbit satellite networks. So one, which is probably the most famous, would be Starlink, but not yet. So keep your eye on that space. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi, the authors were quite bearish on because they think it's very ubiquitous and already low cost or free, so there's not much revenue potential. However, we would argue at DePIN that in the developing world, where Wi-Fi is definitely not ubiquitous, there are great opportunities in places such as India or parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And there's already projects such as YCrypt doing it there and DABA doing it in India. And actually this report touched on both projects. Now, what do telecom networks need? Well, guess what? They need energy. That's right, electricity. In this area of decentralized energy, the authors of the report were quite bullish on. There's regulatory tailwinds pushing us towards the energy transition, and there's a lot of things holding us back that decentralized networks could potentially help resolve, such as issues around the intermittency of clean energy and the need to balance the fluctuating demands on the grid. So they're primarily emphasizing doing this through DERs, or decentralized energy resources, and VPPs, or virtual power plants. So they touched on Daylight, which recently raised $9 million in a Series A from Andreessen Horowitz and is gaining a lot of traction, helping people generate their own DARs and sell that data back to energy companies. They also talked about Sourceful, which is essentially building a decentralized solar power production and storage network as a subnetwork within the greater Helium ecosystem. So sort of piggybacking on those legacy Helium miners, which is an interesting go-to-market model. There's also projects doing it on the financing side. They mentioned Plural, they mentioned Glow, like around monetizing carbon credits and other things. I might argue that it's questionable whether these are actually DePINs. However, Glow is one of the highest revenue generating DePINs of the past year, so definitely a project worth looking out for. They also talked about Power Ledger, Star Power, but they did skip a few kind of usual suspects in the space, such as PowerPod, who's building decentralized EV charging stations, Arcrene, who we've talked about in the past, and C4E, which is building their own layer 1 for building out decentralized energy projects using the DePIN model.
That's a lot of power.
Compute, storage, and bandwidth, a space that's really been heating up, especially with the advent of AI. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what is compute? Well, you could say it's electricity transformed by a machine to perform a calculation. So basically, think about anything your computer does, essentially, is computing. That's why it's called a computer. Now, demand is outsourcing supply. We're basically in a GPU arms race, ladies and gentlemen. For example, Meta spent over $600 million training just one model, which is Llama 3.1, 405B. We need more compute capacity. So, essentially, imagine a world where a participant posts a request for X amount of compute at Y price, and they find within the marketplace a provider to fulfill that request using tokens as the means of exchange. That's essentially the model. Another project they were quite bullish on is on the video side, LivePeer. Why? Because 80% of bandwidth goes to video streaming. It's all those people doing these dances on TikTok, using up all our bandwidth, man. LivePeer, helping solve the problem. They also talked about some of the OGs in the space like Akash, which you might have heard of, and some of the newer entrants that have been growing very fast, namely IONET, but some of the challenges they're facing, such as around spoofing. They did skip Aether, which is interesting, as they've been growing super quickly after their very successful and large node sale this past year, who's basically building out decentralized GPU resources primarily for things like cloud gaming. But before we move, there are some challenges. So even though this space is burning hot, some questions to ask ourselves. How do you reach performance parity? Because, it's cool to decentralize stuff, but if it doesn't work nearly as well as a centralized alternative, well, you're probably going to struggle to gain traction in the market. They were warning us about latency, security, consistency and scalability. For example, how do you handle heavy compute workloads on a consistent basis and also balance load? So, some things to think about. Moving away from compute to one of the other things that computers do, store your data, or at least servers do. You know, the cloud does it, someone does it, it's being stored somewhere, and now it's being decentralized. Who are the poster children of decentralized storage? Filecoin, and many would say Arweave. So they talked about these, which are peer-to-peer networks for storing and retrieving data across the internet. And they also mentioned a project that you may not have heard of, Jackal, which is basically enabling other blockchains to be more efficient in how they store data. They also have a very cool website. And Arweave is doing something a little bit more grandiose. They're focusing on creating what's known as the permaweb. So think about stuff existing on the internet perpetuity. So you can always find that funny joke you made in your blog from 14 years ago. It's still there, ladies and gentlemen, even if you stop paying your hosting bills. So they're doing that with their I/O computer, which is their kind of core product right now, which is a virtual machine to allow developers to build and execute their dApps in one single environment. Finally, in this section, bandwidth retrieval and content delivery networks, also known as CDNs. What are CDNs? They're one of the core infrastructure of our internet, allowing you to basically cache data and retrieve it, aka consume it on your computer very quick. One of the projects they emphasized was Fleek. Why? Because they recently ran some tests, and one key metric known as time to first byte, with a Y, they had speeds that were 7x faster than AWS Lambdas and almost 3 times faster than Versal. That means they're going faster than all the big boys in the centralized space. Now, another one they didn't mention that I think is very fascinating is Mawari, because they're doing something similar, optimizing how you receive content, but they're doing it in the world of XR, or extended reality, where the stakes are even higher, because if that stuff goes too slow with too much latency, you literally get sick. Now, they did mention a need for universal standards amongst all of these different projects in storage, compute, CDNs, etc., because there is probably too much tribalism in the world of Web3. And if you really want this stuff to catch on and you want to go against Microsoft Azure and AWS, etc., you need to have standards and you need to be able to compose with one another. Fourth category today is decentralized AI. So what many people would say is essentially the proxy token for the entire space is BitTensor. So they're an OG in the space. Their token's been growing like crazy the past 2 years. If you've been following DePIN Hub, you'll see it's frequently green, not financial advice, but interesting token to look at in the space. Now, some other projects that are potentially a little bit less known that they mentioned are Prodia, which is building essentially a decentralized image generation at scale. So think about Midjourney meets DePIN, and Grass. Not the one that you sit on, not the one that you smoke, the one that's a browser extension that rewards users for their data by training AI models with it. Recently in the DePIN Revolution event, where they dropped some alpha, their new live context retrieval product is coming on the market, allowing you to take that old data from AI models and update it in real time with what's going on live on the internet. Pretty crazy stuff. Number 5, data capture and management. So this includes mapping networks such as HiveMapper, and also a project maybe you've heard of called Spexy, which is doing the same thing using drones in the sky. Also positioning solutions such as Onakoi, GeoNet, and Foam, which does something similar to Onakoi and GeoNet, but using a completely different technology all on the ground that doesn't utilize satellites. And climate and weather related projects such as PlanetWatch and WeatherXM. So PlanetWatch, as you might know, is now actually part of the ambient network. So think about air quality monitoring and detection. And what's also interesting is that this data can likely be used far beyond just weather. You can be thinking about disaster preparedness in the case of floods, optimizing solar farms for heightened solar production. It's quite interesting what this data can be used for. But that's where it gets important, ladies and gentlemen, because as they pointed out in the report, it's important that these projects understand the value and the market for the data they're collecting, because building a castle of data can very quickly turn into a sandcastle or a house of cards if there's no actual market for that data that you're collecting. For instance, if you're a drone network like Spexy, it's important that that is high enough resolution from the sky that you can actually use and sell that mapping data. Last but not least, services. This one, in the author's own words, is basically a catch-all. But it's a very interesting one, which is essentially pushing the limits of how DePIN can be applied to our world. Demo is one of the projects in the space. Now, you probably heard of them. It's the Fitbit for your car. Very cool project. Puffpaw is one you probably haven't heard about. What are they doing? It's a vape to earn. What? You're telling me that this thing can reward me tokens? Oh my God. I'm not super sure how that works. I don't know, like, if you get more tokens for quitting vaping, and it seems fairly easy to game a system like that, but I guess they're taking that into account. Heal with an E, which is bringing decentralized networks to logistics, a $10.4 trillion industry that, as far as I'm aware, has been ignored up to date in DePIN. Blackbird, which is like a decentralized version of Yelp or Foursquare, restaurant loyalty on chain. Is that DePIN though? Not so sure. And then they went as far as to predict where they think there is space in space for future projects, such as space debris tracking. They also talked about water monitoring, but people are actually already doing that. AquaSave. Distributed robotics training, so Ex Machina would be one project in that space.
I'm back.
And disaster response. So essentially disaster preparedness, which also kind of crosses back over into the climate projects that we talked about under data capture. And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up this whirlwind from Compound's deep dive on DePIN, but we're not going to leave you without some key takeaways. So, obviously, DePIN is hot and growing, but it requires expertise in the industries that you are trying to disrupt if you want to see long-term revenue potential. Projects need to have a clear path towards profitability, else it just ends up being a token for the sake of a token. Speaking of tokens, there's always going to be a challenge around healthy tokenomics. How do you keep incentivizing and rewarding your network even after you've built out meaningful supply and now you're converting to actually provide a real service? Beyond that, cross-pollination and standards creations, we're going to have to work together to create some standards if we want to go into industries that require such things. Then if we go back to our whiteboard over there, we talked about for a DePIN to succeed, you need at least one of the following in the market you're trying to innovate. Scaling is hard. Think about high CapEx and OpEx. Supply and demand inefficiencies, cutting out that middleman, and robust or cheaper end states that can be achieved by leveraging underutilized resources in our environments. Last but not least, ending on a high note, they said beyond DeFi's promises to improve the traditional financial system and create new and more efficient global payment rails, they believe that DePIN, while it does have some challenges, while a lot of the projects are still pre-product market fit, is most likely the next and best use case for crypto to actually innovate in our real world. So keep your eyes on this space. Go to our website and you can read the written version of this recap in newsletter 25. It's on our blog. Or if you feel like dedicating about 6 hours of your life because you love DePIN the way we do, you can go to Compound VC's website and read the whole report for yourself. So closing out, we're going to briefly touch on the podcast. Jesus, get this thing away from me. The last 2 weeks we had SheFi, an organization empowering women on their journey in Web3, and Roam, so a cellular network mapping solution that allows your interactions with the mobile network to turn into valuable rewards. So thank you for the sponsors of the podcast, Peak, the Layer 1 blockchain for DePIN, and Scanit, pioneering the scan-to-earn model, making your receipts work for you so that you are the beneficiary in this digital marketplace that we live in. You can check both of those, as long as 40 plus other episodes of the DePIN Hub podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you like to consume content. Show our co-founder, Daniel Andrade, some love. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps it up for this week's DePIN Hub newsletter recap. And as always, DePIN revolutionaries, stay decentralized.